My name is Sheree Rice, and I'm here with,
Jaleesa Smith.
and we are doing the second part of our coaching cycle for EDLL 605. This go around, Jaleesa watched me teach a lesson, and then she went in to teaching her lesson. Um, so I'm gonna let her talk about first what she saw from my lesson.
Um, so really the main things that stuck out to me, um, again, and we've talked about this before, the rapport that you build with your students. It was really evident that you have taken the time to build those strong relationships with your students. The pacing of your lesson was great. You moved from your transitions were smooth, and you moved from one activity to the next quickly, but you gave your kids enough time to actually get the content. So, whereas a lot of times my warm ups are only 5 minutes, you provided more time for your warm up because you were asking more higher level questions. They had to compare and contrast. They had to tell you what different mathematical terms mean, things like that. So you really gauged how much time you give on certain things depending on what you were asking of them, which I thought was great. And as far as materials goes, you had your materials organized. Everything that you did had a purpose. Everything you used had a purpose. And really, the big thing that I loved about your lesson was the fact that you kind of, at the end of when I did my lesson and we had our post-conference the last time, you gave me a lot of suggestions on how I could incorporate technology into my lesson. And so what was cool was that you actually used those specific strategies in your lesson. So I was able to see that, in practice. You kind of modeled that for me so I could take that when I did my lesson this time.
Yes. I would say transition times help when you're using those things. And then I know our goals were to incorporate technology more and still work on increasing your students' critical thinking skills.
Right.
So I used compare and contrast, and for our students, sometimes at their level, instructional level, that's still kind of, we think it is simple terms, but it's still kind of that higher level questioning. So what I did was ask the students, do you know what compare and contrast means?
Right.
Because sometimes they won't do because they don't simply ask the question. So asking them what it meant, and then having them say, okay, similarities and differences made a lot of sense, and giving them the idea of you can make a chart, you can do a Venn diagram, help them too, because then they're like, oh, I remember doing a Venn diagram at some point in some time, and I know what that means.
Yeah, and that was another thing I got out of your lesson was you really, you let them struggle a little bit trying to figure those things out, where that's an area of need for me because I'm so quick to jump in and help them and save them. And so sometimes, I have to ask these questions, provide that wait time so that they can really think about it, because some of your students were like, what does contrast mean? And you, at that point, you were like, figure it out. Use some different words that might help you figure this out. And so you allowed them to sit there and think first before you were like, okay, this is what it means.
And I think part of the, I will say prior to the lesson, I did talk to them about the purpose of the warm up. Is to access your prior knowledge, to see what you remember, and tell them that this is what this is about. I want to see what you already recall, and if it's something that you can't recall, then we can focus on that as well. And as you saw, some of my kids struggled. They didn't want to try on some things, but I also tell them, how do I know what you don't know? How does your teachers identify that you don't know something if you never attempt to answer it at all?
Right.
Okay. So how did your lesson go once you started using your smart board?
At first, it went really well, but I do want to say that my students were kind of shocked in the beginning because they know that I don't really use my smart board very much, so they were like, what? We're going to write on it, what? And so that automatically engaged them, and so they were all in just because we're doing something different today. And then not only were they doing something different with the smart board, they were also doing something more challenging with the smart board. And so that took it to another level. And usually I would think, gosh, I'm pushing them, so they're gonna be annoyed or but no, they love the fact that they were being challenged, and so that was a huge thing for me.
And I think sometimes because we teach special education and our kids go to other classes and stuff, a lot of them feel like they're looked down upon because they are special, they have these disabilities, but it doesn't make them disability. You know, it doesn't make them that they can't do the work.
Right.
So sometimes they know teachers aren't giving them certain things because, hey, you might struggle. It's not, sometimes they want that challenge.
Right.
So I think that's very good. So what part do you feel like went really well, and what made that evident to you?
So I think that the part that went really well was really allowing them to teach each other. Because in the beginning, what they had to do, they each have a different cycle of life. And so that their particular group was required to create their own Cornell notes, as well as develop their own questions for those Cornell notes. And then they had to share with the next group about, like, so let's say one group had the energy cycle, they had to teach the next group what the energy cycle was all about. And so I think that went really well, which a lot of teachers are nervous to make the students the teachers because they're not really sure what's going to happen. But it changed their whole mindset, and their approach to learning was so different because they knew they were going to have to teach the next group. And so just seeing that and seeing how much time they actually took to do it, made that evident to me that went really well.
That they were invested. That's good. And I think people forget what the purpose of guided practice is. This is their practice before they do it independently. So I'm sure you went around like helping them as they were going through it. So you're guiding their instruction, but you're also making them, you know, in control of their own learning. They're holding themselves accountable at that point. So what do you feel like didn't go as planned?
So one thing that didn't go as planned was not getting the entire lesson into one block. So I was able to complete my entire lesson, but it was split over 2 days. And I think that really was just a result of, this is the first time they were required to do these things. And the first time, you know, they really had to think more critically. And it was content that they had never seen before as well. So it took a lot of different things for them to complete it. And so obviously I planned for the lesson to be in 1 day. So being split into 2 days was not expected, but it ended up working out pretty well at the end.
So what do you feel was unsuccessful in these further refinement, maybe?
Yeah, so one area was when they were developing the questions for their Cornell notes, the point of it is to have the questions on the left side that the notes on the right side answers. So if it's, you know, the definition of biology, to ask the question, what is biology, that makes sense. But if I had those same notes that says the definition of biology, and I'm asking, you know, what jobs are related to biology, those two things don't match. And so at some point, because I had them developing the questions on their own, I was noticing some of the questions, they couldn't be answered by the notes. And so I didn't at that point step in and bring us together as a whole group to go over, okay, these are the questions I'm looking for. And I feel like I could have stepped in at that point. And I think that I was focused on, okay, this is the first time I'm doing this lesson, let's get through it, you know, things like that, that I just completely didn't.
But then this is why we reflect back on our teaching, and what you can do is like, now I know, okay, here's what I can explicitly tell them what we expect questions to look like. Like, hey, you did a really good job, you know, attempting this on your own. You formulated these questions. However, did our questions always match the description that your notes were in? So then you can go over like another activity, like, hey, why is this a bad question? Not necessarily a bad question, but why wouldn't this be the question we would use in this situation to match with the notes that we gave?
Right, and that actually makes a lot of sense, because I could really, like, now that I didn't do it right then, I can now go and look at all of their notes and just kind of see, and then make that a whole new lesson where we just focus on that question development skills, you know.
And that's really culturally and developmental, you know, teaching approach, because this is what they developed, and you could take their questions as a whole as an example and use, okay, these were good questions, but how do we make them better? So then they're also like, oh, we know where these questions came from. We did this. And instead of like, if you use one person example and point it out, like, here's some things, they're all their questions. Like, how do we make these better? How do we refine these?
Right, and that was actually something that you pointed out to me during our post-conference on the last lesson, where you really start to bring in those higher level thinking skills when you look at an example that's not necessarily the best, and then you take that and you try to revise it into something that's better. And so that was something I took away from you, and so now I can do that with these questions. So that just set me right up for.
Look at that. Look how it works now. So do you feel your materials met the activity and group objective, and what makes you know that?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that the graphic organizers that you sent me really helped the kids because it provided that visual learning for them rather than me just standing up talking. And then the incorporation of the smartboard, completely effective because it got them immediately engaged. They really loved the fact that they were able to get up and write on the board themselves and really do things themselves instead of it being totally teacher-led. The textbook was very effective that we used because a lot of times we don't use that very much, but it put the content in real simple terms. And the fact that I was able to put them in groups helped because I don't have a lot of textbooks. So it was enough for me to group the students and have them, work together.
How did the group go? How did the group work go?
Yeah, so the group work, I was very impressed. So the group rubric that you provided for me, I had never explicitly told students that, you are going to be graded based on how well you work together. When I stated that and actually pulled up the rubric and showed them this is what you are going to be assessed on as far as like working together, that completely, the light bulb went off in their head, and I had never seen them work together that well, ever. And I've been here for like 2.5 years now. And so it was incredible. I mean, they were reading to each other. If students had a question on a word, they would try to help the student figure out how to say that word. They were giving each other high fives. Like, it was just an incredible thing to see. So,
okay, so that's good. Look, give yourself a pat over that. But let me ask you, did you feel overwhelmed by any of the material?
I really didn't. I think that everything was set up very. It was structured well. It was easy to access. I didn't know, because when you sent me the graphic organizer, I didn't know that as soon as I opened it, it would take it right to my smartboard notebook. And so I had no problem. I had no problems using anything.
Yeah, so that's good. Easy access. So do you think the students mastered the lesson objective?
Yeah, so I had all students except one meet my objective that day. And the one student that didn't meet my objective, he came in halfway throughout the lesson, so he wasn't provided with the background knowledge. And then he didn't start on the core no notes when the other students did, so he missed that kind of group work thing. But, and as you can see here, I have one example of one of my students, but so they were able to take this graphic organizer, and in their own words, they were able to describe each cycle of life, which was incredible. And so that's kind of how I assess whether or not they met my objective. Were they able to describe each of those cycles?
Gotcha. So that's good. Now, did you do any tweaking as they did when they went up to the board? Did you do any tweaking of what they put up there?
Occasionally I did. Some of it was just, spelling sometimes, and then other times it was the arrangement. In other words, I tried to make sure that I didn't, discourage them because it was their first time doing it, but sometimes words just needed to be switched in different places, and spelling needed to be fixed, but we did that kind of as a class, what letter should we add here, or,
And you realize that goes into your literacy, doing that, is teaching them, the sentence structure. That's all a part of literacy. That I know sometimes when we teach these other contents, such as math and science, we don't always see the reading behind it and how those little things are. That's grammar. Most people think grammar should be done in English class, but that's
it can be
tweaking
done
and some to
anywhere.
teach those things. Yeah.
Right.
So, what do you feel was an area of strength for this lesson for you, and why?
I feel like one area of strength was really me, sitting back, because like I said before, I'm typically so quick to just jump in there and help them. I really was just a facilitator for this lesson. I let them guide their learning, and so I think that was really cool. And I know the students were happy because they were like, yes, like I don't have to hear her talk for 90 minutes. So that was a strength because they were able to see at the end of it, I can take control of my learning and I can do it well. I think that another strength of my lesson was that incorporation of technology, because it was just incredibly effective. Not that I'm, the best at it, because I've only, tried it once, but it was a strength for that particular lesson because the graphic organizer really helped the students to meet the objective for the day.
Right. And I would say that is the strength as well. Like it's hard sometimes to go up and do something different, especially in front of your kids. And even when you're like, I'm buying into it, but I'm a little nervous. It
Right.
might be, this is out of my usual. Our kids feed off of that.
Right.
So, it's a time for celebration. I did something that's not my normal. My kids were actively engaged in it and participated and did better than maybe what I anticipated.
Right.
So what do you think was the area of improvement for this lesson?
Yeah, so even though I feel like for this particular lesson, an area of strength was the incorporation of technology, I also feel like it's an area of improvement, simply because it's not something that I'm very familiar with. And so that's something that I want to continually try to refine and try to improve on. I think another one, just like we talked about before, would be that, taking that time to have those lessons about, how can we make these questions better? And sometimes the best time to do that is right when you see it, but other times you can save it for later. But just as far as like how that lesson went, I feel like I probably should have stepped in a little bit right when it was happening, because they were going to have to teach each other.
Right. So that could be a thing, is when you see that, like, you can say, hey, let's pause for a second. Let's talk about the quality of questions that we are creating,
Right.
And that's a good thing. Did you ask them, like, for their feedback at the end, like, how do they think the lesson went? And what?
Yeah, and so I got really good feedback on that. I try to do that after every lesson. Like, how do you guys feel about this first? Do you feel like you met the objective before I even check it? And then 3, the activities we did today, how did you feel about those? And I got really good feedback from them because they love the fact that, 1, they were able to take ownership, and then 2, they actually felt like they learned how to work together. I mean, I had students working together who thought they didn't like each other.
So it's always a good thing.
Yeah, and so it was a big deal, and then they liked the fact that they were able to get up out of their seats and go to the board. And in that, they felt like they had purpose, because them putting that up on the board is obviously providing, instruction for the rest of the class. So.
Right. Okay. So do you feel like your goals were met during this coaching cycle? Why or why not?
Yeah, absolutely. The pretty much my main goals were to incorporate technology, which was done, and then also to do those higher level thinking skills. And I think the fact that they were required, I didn't give them the notes. They were required to go into the text and create notes based off of what they read, and then try and develop good questions for their notes. They were already thinking at a level that they wouldn't have previously thought on.
Okay.
And so then with that, the fact that they not only had to, say, okay, these are the 4 cycles of life, what are they? Describe those to me. And so they had to do those too. So I felt like that was a goal that was met as well. And then also, I really didn't say that this was a goal previously, but it's always been a goal for me. And I feel like I've built good relationships with my kids, but I feel like, you can always improve in that area. And after seeing you interact with your students in the classroom and, joking around with them, things like that, it was kind of cool. Like, I could see how it was evident that you had built those relationships. And so that kind of taught me to kind of take myself a little less seriously, because I feel like as, newer teachers, we feel like we have to, like,
Be by the
but
book.
it's better to be able to joke with your kids and to have those, relationships with the kids. It's more important than almost anything else, you know? And so that's always been a goal of mine. And so I feel like that was meant too, even though that was something you didn't know about. That was actually something you taught me.
Yeah. Okay. You know, what would you like? Anything? You know, this is bringing out the coaching cycle for the class to end. But what could, you know, would it be anything else you'd like to focus on? I know we previously talked about, you know, the critical thinking things,
Mhm.
you know, and as far as aspects, and we talked about putting that language into your lesson plans, you know. Is there anything else outside of this that you would want to work on?
Yeah, so one thing that there's actually two things. The first one is incorporating like creation into my lessons.
Mhm.
Like I want them to start creating things for themselves, and whether that is like, you know, if we're working with biology, having them create their own ecosystem or things like that. I feel like that's always a fun way to, you know, engage students. And a lot of times I just don't know the best way to do that.
Mhm.
So that's something that I would like to focus on. Obviously, continue to incorporating the technology. I feel like, you know, going from not using it at all really, besides the students' Chromebooks, I feel like I should maybe start trying to use it at least 3 times a week. Try to incorporate one activity, you know, for 3 days out of the week where we are using technology just to get myself into that habit.
Right.
I think focusing on that is going to really help me to be a better educator for my kids.
Okay. I think those are really good, and I think setting a goal for yourself, saying that the 3 times a week is really achievable. I mean, your warm up could be just posted on the board, like
Right.
anything that you scan or you can snip and take a screenshot of. Once you lock it in to where it can't move or download it, you can insert that picture within your notebook, which it becomes easy for them to access on the smartboard.
Yeah, and that's actually going to be so helpful for me because I literally write everything on my whiteboard myself. So if I have like 6 multiple choice questions, I write them on my whiteboard, and so it'll be a time saver.
It's time saver, and you don't have to worry about erasing the thing
Right.
for the next class. You can
Right.
just circle and click out of there and be good. But I will have to say I enjoy and I appreciate you letting me
Yeah, of course.
help you and transition through this. You know, and I hope you'll let me help you in the future. Whatever question you had, you know, I'm always available for you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.